welcome to the family gathering. Thanks for tuning in. Pastor Brett here. We are glad that you are a part of this ministry called the Family Gathering. Tonight and this evening, we are dedicating this update to our children and youth. So the kids are out of school now. Well, I guess they've been out of school for a while, but officially they're out of school now. And there's a lot going on for our children and youth despite COVID-19. We'll start with the children. So each week, if you come to church, there's a children's worship bag for each child that comes. Color crayons, coloring items, other things to play with. I actually picked up some this last Sunday. It's a great little bag they have that Ashley and Tristan have put together. Also, we are doing Vacation Bible School this summer. It's August 17th through the 19th. You can sign up now. They have to cap it at 100 kids. We're doing it off-site of Camano Chapel. We're actually doing it at the Four Springs Reserve on Camano Island. So check out online registration and more information about our VBS, Vacation Bible School, this year. For our junior high, we have Summer at the Beach, Tuesdays from 6 to 7:30, the Camano Country Club, Beach number 2. You can check out more information again on our website. Speaking of junior high, Survivor Camp. That's our junior high 5th through 8th grade camp. At this point, is still on August 10th through the 15th up on Orcas Island. Check out again more information on our website. Pretty much you can check out information on our website for anything. So I'll stop saying that now. So just check out our website. For senior high, there's the Capstone Summer Tour. And that's also on Tuesdays at 6:30. It's at various houses and parks throughout Camano and throughout Stanwood. So again, check the Capstone Instagram for more information regarding that. Also, from June 28th to July 4th, our Fireworks Youth Fundraiser, QFC parking lot in Stanwood and the IGA parking lot on Camano Island are going on. Again, June 28th through July 4th. And that just gives money to our youth to help with camps, to help with spring breakout, and help with different outreach events throughout the year. So that's what we got going on for children's, junior high, and high school ministries at Camano Chapel this summer. We'd love to get your child, your youth, again, your grandchild or great-grandchild involved. You can talk with Ashley, Pastor Matt, or Aaron Chimple Barden for more information on those different ministries. So here's an update on our COVID-19. We are now in phase 3 in Island County. It really doesn't mean a whole lot for us on our church services on Sunday, except for it allows for a few more people inside. Our outside services are stay about the same, weather permitting. Our inside service, it allows up to 400 or whatever, half of the capacity, whichever's less. But it also involves social distancing. So know that probably the most we'll be able to fit in the gym for social distancing is about 150 people. So not a big difference, but again, wanted to let you know of those changes for phase 3. Face masks are still required. And so hopefully here in the near future, we'll be able to see everybody at church again. But until then, we have our home churches, house churches, and then also the inside and outside ministries for Sunday. So for tonight, Dr. Fectus is going to be talking on John chapter 11. It's an interesting chapter for me personally because this last week I've been really thinking about why do we go to church? Why do we go to church and see our people? I call them our people, our family. It's because God's family and God himself created us in his image. He created us for relationship. And it's interesting, as we look at John chapter 11, it's the healing of Lazarus. Jesus' healing of him. And it's all about relationships. And so as Dr. Feckus looks at this chapter, be thinking about why do I go to church? It's because of relationships, and it's because we want to worship God, and we want to have a relationship with him and his people. So he's going to be looking at Jesus and the different relationships within this story, which include the Bethany family, which includes the disciples, Martha, Mary, and finally, Lazarus. I hope you're doing well. I look forward to seeing you if I haven't seen you for a while. And I hope that I get to see you soon. God bless.
All right, good evening. Welcome to another Bible study on the Gospel of John, family gathering. Tonight we're going to be looking at the raising of Lazarus story in John chapter 11. And that puts us about halfway through the Gospel. Although I think in the second half we won't be doing quite as many studies. We spent quite a bit of time on the prologue. And tonight, it's a pretty long passage, so it's 57 verses, and I'm not sure I'll read the whole thing just to save some time, so it's always a good idea to, you can always pause and get your outline and maybe take some time to read through the passage yourself. So the story of Lazarus is the seventh sign. It's kind of the final climactic sign in the first half of the gospel, which is called the Book of Signs. And this last sign also contains the very important I am statement. It's the fifth out of seven with a predicate, I am the resurrection and the life. So what happens in the Gospel of John after this is that as far as the organization of the gospel, Jesus' ministry is completed. There aren't any more public discourses. And so from now on, John's going to focus on the culminating events, kind of the final week of Jesus' life related to the final Passover festival in Jerusalem. And this raising is quite unique. We don't have the raising of Lazarus in the Synoptic Gospels. We have some other raising stories. We have Jairus' daughter, which is mentioned in Matthew and Mark. And we have the widow of Nain's son in Luke. But John's the only one to really record the raising of Lazarus. And so we'll start out with the first section in 11:1 through 6. I will read some of the beginning of this. Jesus and the Bethany family. Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and his sister Martha. Mary was the one who anointed the Lord with perfume and wiped his feet with her hair. Her brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent a message to Jesus, Lord, he whom you love is ill. But when Jesus heard it, he said, this illness does not lead to death. Rather, it is for God's glory, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. Accordingly, though Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, after having heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. So we know Mary and Martha from a story in the Gospel of Luke, in Luke 10:38 through 42, where Jesus was teaching in their home. And, Martha was bothered because Mary was sitting at Jesus' feet, listening to him as a rabbi. But Lazarus is not mentioned there, so he's only mentioned in this particular Gospel. And these names are very common. Lazarus, which is kind of a Greek form of Eliezer. Eliezer is probably, I think it's the third most popular name for a man in that time period. And Mary is by far the most popular name for a woman. I think about 1 in 5 women would have been named Mary. So this is why you need other titles to, identify people. So you have Mary Magdalene, you have Mary, the mother of Jesus, you have Mary, wife of Clopas, you have another unidentified Mary. I think there are like 6 Marys in the New Testament. And people were proud of their Jewish heritage, and so they were using names from the Old Testament. And Mary is really not what she would have been called. She would have been called Miriam. In that time period. Mary's kind of the Greek form of it, and even in the Greek of this passage, it is often Miriam, after the sister of Moses. So I'm kind of disappointed when I watch The Chosen that they don't call Jesus Yeshua, which would be the Aramaic of the Hebrew Joshua, because that's what he would have been called in his day. Anyway, so this family does seem to be very special to Jesus. Their home, which is just a little under 2 miles from Jerusalem, seems to have been a place that Jesus and his disciples frequented when they were in the area from Galilee and enjoying their hospitality. So leading up to our chapter, in just a little bit earlier in chapter 10, John tells us that when Jesus heard the news of Lazarus' illness, he was teaching across the Jordan River in a place that John the Baptist had been preaching himself earlier in the gospel. And this is also a place that's called Bethany, but it's called Bethany across the Jordan, and which is mentioned in John 1:28. So it's interesting that after receiving the news, Jesus stays 2 more days in that place. He doesn't rush back to Bethany. And there's a couple reasons for that, probably. One is if he would have left right away, we find out later that Lazarus has been dead for 4 days, so you can do the math, he would have already been dead. The other thing that commentators mention is that there was kind of this popular folk belief that the spirit of the person after death hovered above the body for 3 days. And it wasn't really certain that they were dead until after that period of 3 days. And so some people think that Jesus is wanting to make sure everybody knows he's really dead, so that when he raises him from the dead, there aren't any questions. The next section is Jesus then interacting with his disciples, verse 7 and following. Then after this, he said to the disciples, "Let us go to Judea again." The disciples said to him, "Rabbi, the Jews were just now trying to stone you, and are you going there again?" Jesus answered, "Are there not 12 hours of daylight? Those who walk during the day do not stumble because they see the light of the world. But those who walk at night stumble because the light is not in them." After saying this, he told them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I am going there to awaken him." The disciples said to him, "Lord, if he's fallen asleep, he will be all right." Jesus, however, had been speaking about his death, but they thought that he was referring merely to sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, "Lazarus is dead. For your sake, I'm glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him." Thomas, who was called the twin, or Didymus, said to his fellow disciples, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." So when Jesus informs them that he wants to travel back to Judea, to go to Bethany, they are very surprised because in the recent visits there, it hasn't gone too well as far as the Jewish authorities are concerned. And just recently, they tried to stone Jesus. So Jesus gives this kind of cryptic response about the hours in the day. And yes, there are 12 hours in the day, and Jews separated the day into 2 halves. And so you had sunrise to sunset, like in Fiddler on the Roof, sunrise, sunset, and then you had sunset to sunrise. That was another 12 hours. And those were often divided again into like 4 watches or even hours of the day, so like the 6th hour. But what Jesus is talking there about is the idea of the daytime being the period of his ministry, and that he has a certain limited period of time in which to do his mission. And this is a theme that's very, very important in the Gospel of John, is the idea of his hour. So in his own understanding throughout the gospel about the timing of his ministry and the anticipated hour of fulfillment. Sometimes your translations will use the word time, but in Greek it's really the word hour. So earlier in 7:30 it says, "Then they tried to arrest him, but no one laid hands on him because his hour had not yet come." So in this discussion, Jesus has another one of these kind of double meanings where he says Lazarus has fallen asleep, and that was a euphemism for death, so people could misunderstand you. "Oh, if he's just asleep, Jesus, what's the big deal? I'm sure he's going to be better." And then Jesus has to say, no, he's dead, guys. And then Thomas kind of has a little bit of an ironic statement there at the end. Let us go that we may die with him. Kind of sounds like Eeyore. But there's a bit of irony in that too, because he is speaking somewhat a true statement there, that they will eventually be called on to die with him. So there's a good quote there from Colin Kruse about the idea of the hour. The words, "my time has not yet come," include the first of 9 references to Jesus' hour, or time, a significant theme in this gospel. The first 3 references indicate that Jesus' hour has not yet come. The last 6 indicate that it had come. The hour towards which everything moves is the hour of Jesus' glorification, which takes place through his death, resurrection, and exaltation. No machinations of Jesus' opponents could bring his ministry to a premature end. He would not surrender himself to their hands until his hour had come. And as we get into the second half of the gospel, we'll see that there'll be these further references to the idea of his hour, which is now impending. So the next section is Jesus' encounter with Martha. I'll go ahead and read that one. When Jesus arrived, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Now Bethany was near Jerusalem, some 2 miles away. And many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them about their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, while Mary stayed at home. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, and the one coming into the world." So after a couple of days' journey, Jesus arrives in Bethany, and by this time, Lazarus has been in the tomb for 4 days. It was very important in the Jewish tradition to bury a corpse as soon as possible, preferably on the same day of death, if not, at least by the second day of death. And mourning was a very important communal tradition, which went on for a full week, just like a marriage festival went on for a week as well. And so the funeral here is been going on, probably for almost 4 days, and people are coming from nearby Jerusalem. And so in the conversation between Jesus and Martha, there's a typical misunderstanding of his words. This is very common in John, as we've seen even earlier in this story. And Martha confirms the common expectation of the Pharisees in a general resurrection. Most Jews really believed in some kind of general resurrection. And Sadducees, of course, did not believe in the resurrection. I don't think Samaritans did either. But the majority of Jews believed that there would be a future general resurrection of both the righteous and the unrighteous. And this is something that Jesus has already spoken of in chapter 5, where he says, "Do not be amazed at this, for a time is coming when all who are in their graves will hear his voice and come out. Those who have done good to the resurrection of life, those who have done evil to the resurrection of condemnation." And so it's at this point that Jesus has his very important "I am" statement, "I am the resurrection and the life." And in response to that, Mary confesses her belief in him with 3 important Christological statements: Messiah, Son of God, the one coming into the world, which all of these titles have already been mentioned earlier in chapter 1. So then we have the encounter between Jesus and Mary. in 11:28 and following. I guess I'll read most of this passage. When she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary and told her privately, "The teacher is here and is calling for you." And when she heard it, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet come to the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. The Jews who were with her in the house, consoling her, saw Mary get up quickly and go out. They followed her because they thought that she was going to the tomb to weep there. When Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at his feet and said to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. He said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus began to weep. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him?" But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind have kept this man from dying?" So John really stretches this story out, kind of builds the suspense of the story with all these different conversations with disciples and Martha and now Mary. And Mary states her belief that Jesus could have prevented Lazarus' death, presumably by some kind of a healing miracle, as he has done previously, leading up to this. But when Jesus sees her weeping and mourning, and he sees all of the people who have come to mourn with this family, it seems to really deeply affect him. And it's interesting that John uses this very strong language. He was greatly disturbed in spirit. He was deeply moved within. And this is something that's repeated a few verses later in verse 38, at least the second part of that. And one of the problems here that commentators and translators have is that the word for disturbed in spirit, or disturbed, it does say in spirit in the Greek, is a very strong word which often in other contexts means anger or indignation. Some translations will say groaned or distressed or shuddered. They're not quite sure what to do with it. And so I put four different ideas of how people interpret this. Some people think Jesus is angry at the grief that's displayed and the lack of trust that he could change the situation. So they take the word in kind of its more common sense of anger, and trying to figure out, well, if he's angry, what's he angry about? Number two, others, that he is angry at death itself as a corrupting power in God's good creation, which makes some sense. Still others, he is angry because this situation will precipitate his own suffering and death. And that is certainly true. This is the event that sets into motion the arrest of Jesus and his crucifixion later. But most translations end up softening the language because of the immediate context and the response of Jesus. He weeps himself with those who are weeping. And the other mourners there interpret that as an indication of how much Jesus loved him. This is the first time in the gospel that we have this idea of Lazarus being one that Jesus loved. And it's only after this that we have the mention of the disciple whom Jesus loved. And so this is why some commentators think that the gospel was actually written by Lazarus. And one of the evidences they use for that is at the end of the gospel. There's a rumor that the beloved disciple would not die, which would kind of make sense if he's been raised from the dead. But that's probably not the intention of this story here. And the idea that Lazarus is loved and Jesus loves him is something that's already affirmed by the sisters early in the story and John earlier in the story as well. So if the people were wrong about Jesus' motive, John has every opportunity to add a little parenthesis to say they were mistaken in that. And word meanings always have to depend on the context. Words can mean very different things depending on the context. So some words can mean 9 or 10 different things depending on the local context or the context within the particular book and how that writer uses the book. So we kind of have to be careful and always explore how a particular writer uses a word. A good example here is just the word for love. We have the word philos, which is typically understood as brotherly love, and you have agape. And John uses both of those words here to describe Jesus' love for Lazarus. And if you study those two words in the gospel, you'll see that John tends to use them as synonyms. He doesn't have a lot of difference between those words. And we always think, well, agape is the greater love. Well, it depends on the context. It depends on the time period. So words don't really have root meanings that you can kind of transfer down to history. Most people in that time period, most people today, don't even know what root meanings are of words. So the next section, then, we come to the actual raising of Lazarus, verse 38 and following. Then Jesus, again greatly disturbed, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, already there is a stench because he has been dead 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone, and Jesus looked upward and said, "Father, I thank you for having heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I have said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, he cried with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with strips of cloth, and his face wrapped in a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." So finally, Jesus makes his way to the tomb. A cave tomb would probably indicate a more well-to-do family. It could be a cave above the ground. It could be a cave in the ground. The stone could be round and rolled, or it could be square over the covering. We don't know exactly what this one was. And Jesus gives instructions to take that stone away. And of course, Martha's trying to warn Jesus, Jesus, he's been in there 4 days. And even though they did wrap the body with spices, that was just to help the odor of the body. It didn't help anything with the decomposition of the body. And Jews didn't practice embalming like the Egyptians, so it's not like Lazarus here is a mummy coming out of the tomb, even though he is wrapped in some kind of cloth. And of course, it's a warm climate. So it's interesting that Jesus then prays to the Father, but his prayer isn't one asking to raise Lazarus. It's a prayer of thanks that God has already heard him. And it's as if the following restoration was a foregone conclusion, that Jesus knew what God was going to do. And the raising here, commentators will call it different things. Some call it a restoration, some call it a raising. Not many will call it a resurrection, actually, because it's not the same kind of resurrection as Jesus will experience. And so probably most often theologians will call it a resuscitation, not a resurrection, because Lazarus is going to die again, whereas Jesus is not. And so the importance of this story in John is that it forms kind of a bookend with the resurrection of Jesus later. And it prepares the way for his death, burial, and resurrection. And so that's why you see all of these little details of the story that will then come up again later in the resurrection of Jesus. The number of days, the mourning women, a rock-hewn tomb sealed with a stone, grave clothes, and there's a specific detail of the head cloth, the face cloth, along with people who are doubting, just like Thomas later. So then finally, in the last major section, we have the response of the Sanhedrin. Looks like we have time. I guess I'll go ahead and read it. Many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what Jesus did, believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what he had done. So the chief priests and the Pharisees called a meeting of the council and said, "What are we to do? This man is performing many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and destroy both our holy place and our nation." But one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, "You know nothing at all. You do not understand that it is better for you to have one man die for the people than have the whole nation destroyed." He did not say this on his own, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus was about to die for the nation, and not for the nation only, but to gather into one the dispersed children of God. So from that day on, they planned to put him to death. So the Sanhedrin is the Jewish council of 70 or sometimes 71, which is made up of religious leaders, chief priests, some Pharisees. And as with many of the stories previous in the Gospel of John, the healings, the miracles, the various encounters, there is a mixed reaction to even this startling sign of the raising of Lazarus. And as always in the gospel, people kind of divide between these two poles, these twin poles of belief versus unbelief. And the fact that many believed in him as a result of the event and the nearness of the Passover festival forces the religious leaders to a crisis point. So they're thinking, look, if something isn't done soon, there's a growing messianic movement. And with messianic movements in that time period, there were many messianic pretenders before and after the period of Jesus, probably at least a dozen. They all knew what would happen. A crowd of people would follow this Messiah, and the Romans would destroy them, or the Romans would crucify them, or they would kill them, and that was the end. And so they're thinking that's going to happen here. And so they're afraid that this is going to bring political, social instability and invite the intervention of the Romans and possibly the destruction of the city, the temple, and the nation. And of course, when John is writing in 90-something AD, he and his readers are well aware that that is exactly what happened in 70 AD, that the Romans came and besieged the city starting in 66. The Jewish War began in 66, and the city was besieged and eventually destroyed by the Roman army. And even once again in the 132 AD, there's another messianic movement that rose up with the backing of a very prominent rabbi. And the same thing happened there. There was a war, and the Romans came and destroyed Jerusalem. So it's at that point that the high priest Caiaphas proposes an ironic solution. It's better for you that one man die for the people than that the whole nation perish. Now, John says that Caiaphas was high priest that year. But what he means there is that he was high priest the year, the momentous year of Jesus' crucifixion. The high priesthood was a lifelong position, and we know that Caiaphas was high priest from 18 to 36 AD. So, and it's interesting that a number of years ago, when they were building in Jerusalem and bulldozers were clearing some area, they found a tomb with some ossuaries. An ossuary is a bone box, and you can see a picture of the ossuary of Joseph Caiaphas. Josephus, the Jewish historian, mentions Joseph Caiaphas as the high priest, and they found a bone box with the bones of a 60-year-old man, his wife, and some children. And what would happen is they would lay people in the tomb at first with the spices, and then when the body had fully decomposed, they would take the bones and they would put them in an ossuary or a stone box, which was just about big enough or just big enough for the femur. And this was an expectation of the resurrection. You wanted to gather their bones together for the day of resurrection. And so it's interesting that we found that particular bone box of Joseph Caiaphas, the high priest. And I say ironic solution because John interprets his statement there in another way, in a double sense. Of course, politically, what Caiaphas is saying, look, it's better that Jesus gets crucified and we stop this movement than the whole nation is destroyed or the temple is destroyed. And John interprets that as a prophecy, in a sense, that Jesus is indeed dying for the whole nation. He's dying for the sins of the nation. And it's interesting that in verse 52 it says to gather together into one the dispersed children of God. And so there's this reference to the exile and the idea that the Jews have been dispersed everywhere. But also what this takes into account is also the Samaritans and the Gentiles, because this has been prepared for in the prologue in chapter 1, where it says he came to his own did not receive him, but to all who received him, he said that they could be children of God. And we have that phrase here, children of God, born not of blood or a particular background, but anyone can be a child of God. So this sets into motion the plot to kill Jesus and transitions John's narrative from stories of mission to the final week of Jesus' passion and preparation of the disciples. It's another irony that he who brought life, he who raised people from the dead, is now going to have his life taken from him. And so John, here in the middle of his gospel, is now preparing for what we call the Passion narrative. And this is where all four gospels come together. I mean, there might be differences in the stories of each gospel, and John certainly has very different stories. But it's at this point that all four gospels, like four streams really, are coming into one stream of the Passion narrative. And passion is from the Latin word passio, to suffer. And so it's here that the Gospels work towards this very important story, which probably was an oral tradition first before they were written down. And some commentators will call the Gospels a passion narrative with a long introduction, because everything is really heading towards this part of the Gospel. So what's the response of Jesus to this? Just the last part here of chapter 11. Jesus therefore no longer walked about openly among the Jews, but went from there to a town called Ephraim in the region near the wilderness, and he remained there with his disciples. Now the Passover of the Jews was near, and many went up from the country to Jerusalem before the Passover to purify themselves. They were looking for Jesus and were asking one another as they stood in the temple, "What do you think? Surely he will not come to the festival, will he?" Now the chief priests and the Pharisees had given orders that anyone who knew where Jesus was should let them know, so that they might arrest him. So Jesus now realizes that his hour is at hand, and he withdraws temporarily to a remote place near the wilderness. Amidst speculation from the people, is he going to come to the Passover? And in the Greek, it's implying no, he isn't. And the authorities are ordering a warrant for his arrest. So as we think about this passage, as far as the application, in relation to Jesus' response here to mourning, to human frailty, to grief, it really invites us to consider and maybe even reconsider our views of God and the revelation of God's nature through Jesus, who is the Word made flesh. So, Christian grief and empathy. How should a believer respond to personal loss and death in the light of the hope of the resurrection? Some people would quote or perhaps misquote Paul's words in 1 Thessalonians 4:13, where he's writing to comfort the Thessalonians because some of them have died and they're grieving. And Paul says that they should not grieve for those loved ones who had died as those who have no hope. But Paul is not saying there that grief itself is wrong. He's talking about two different types of grief. There's a hopeless grief, which some of us have probably experienced or seen at certain funerals. But there's also an appropriate grief that also has hope for those loved ones. And Jesus himself in the Gospel of John assumes that his disciples will grieve, that they'll weep, that they'll mourn. These are all words that he uses in John 16 for when he is taken away from them. And as I alluded to earlier, Paul in Romans 12 says we're called to weep with those who weep. And even one of the Beatitudes of Jesus in Matthew 5 says, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." And we also know that Jesus weeps a few other times. He weeps over Jerusalem in the final week. The book of Hebrews talks about how he entreats God with loud cries and tears in a discussion of the Gethsemane experience of Jesus. And so what does that say about Jesus? There's a good quote there from N.T. Wright. "To begin with, we should not rest content, as some older writers did, with treating Jesus' tears as evidence that he was a real human being, not just a divine being playing at being human. That is no doubt true. But nobody in Jesus' world imagined he was anything other than a real flesh and blood human being, with emotions like everyone else. Rather, throughout the gospel, John is telling us something much more striking, that when we look at Jesus, not least when we look at Jesus in tears, we are seeing not just a flesh and blood human being, but the Word made flesh. The Word, through whom the worlds were made, weeps like a baby at the grave of a friend. Only when we stop and ponder this will we understand the full mystery of John's gospel. Only when we put away our high and dry pictures of who God is and replace them with pictures in which the Word, who is God, can cry with the world's crying, will we discover what the word God really means. We can't separate what Jesus is doing and who Jesus is from who God is. And so secondly, what does that reveal about God? Historically, the doctrine of impassibility, and that's a doctrine developed in the early church to say that God cannot experience certain emotions and passions. That doctrine of impassibility has often been influenced more by Greek philosophy than by biblical theology. And the proper understanding of what this doctrine means and doesn't mean doesn't simply come from the New Testament story of a suffering and crucified God, a theology of the cross. The Old Testament also reveals to us a passionate and vulnerable God, unafraid to show emotion and weep over his wounded creation. And there are various passages in the Old Testament that talk about the passion of God, the grief of God, the woundedness of God. Jürgen Moltmann has written, "A God who cannot suffer is poorer than any man. For a God who is incapable of suffering is a being who cannot be involved. Suffering and injustice do not affect him. And because he is so completely insensitive, he cannot be affected or shaken by anything. He cannot weep, for he has no tears. But the one who cannot suffer cannot love either. So he is a loveless being." You can't have one without the other. You can't have the deep emotion and feelings of love without the deep emotion and passion of feeling and suffering. However one understands the doctrine of impassibility, it cannot mean that God is unaffected or emotionless in relation to human experience. That's not the picture we get in the Bible or the picture we get specifically here in the Gospel of John, that God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. In closing, there's a great quote on that from Terence Fretheim, used to be a professor at Luther Seminary. The God who calls others to a vocation that may entail suffering is no stranger to that kind of vocation and to that suffering. The God who knows the sufferings of Israel has in Jesus Christ entered deeply into our suffering world and made it his own, so that neither suffering nor evil constitutes a final word for the creation. God is not like a mechanic who chooses to fix the suffering of the world from outside the world. God is more like good medicine, choosing to heal the world from within. By entering deeply into its life, God saves the world by taking its suffering into the very heart of the divine life, bearing it there, and then wearing it in the form of a cross. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for this great story of the resurrection of Lazarus. We thank you for what it teaches us about the miracles and the power of Jesus, who is one with you. We thank you for the weeping of Jesus, the mourning of Jesus, the sorrow of Jesus. We thank you for the theology of the cross and the upside-down kingdom, and that you have overcome evil through suffering, through sacrifice, through servant leadership. We thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.